Welcome back. A tale of inheritance, silence and rot, drawn from the margins of forgotten archives. Tonight we descend into a history best left sealed, but the records persist, and so must the telling. Before we continue, like, subscribe and share. Charleston 1701. The first name appears not in a parish register, nor in a ship's manifest, but in the account book of Edmund Greyfield, one of Charleston's wealthiest planters. Esperanza de Lima, female, aged 15, purchased Lisbon, Negro, but of mixed stock, brought for domestic service, price £42. No description follows. No height, no complexion, no comment on temperament, just a name, a price, a date. But from that single ledger line spreads a silence that would stretch 15 years. A silence so absolute it unsettled even men accustomed to treating flesh as property. Greyfield, master of an estate of 600 acres and 300 enslaved people, was a founding figure of what contemporaries called the Rice Council. 14 planters, who between them commanded nearly half the colony's wealth. Their names filled the rolls of vestry and militia alike: Rutherford, Sutton, Kingsley, Petton, Caldwell, Warwick, Baxter. Each prided himself not only on dominion over land and labor, but on the performance of cruelty. Charleston was young then, its brick houses raw against the river mud, its plantations etched from swamps with blood and iron. Authority was proven not by restraint but by spectacle. Into this world came Esperanza, the girl who would not speak. Accounts differ as to whether she had already lost her tongue. Some whispered that Lisbon traders had mutilated her aboard ship. Others believed she withheld her words deliberately, knowing silence in such a place could unnerve more than any defiance. In Greyfield's household, she cooked, she scrubbed, she carried linen to the rooms of guests, whose names would later become infamous. She bent her head at orders, but never answered. Greyfield's overseers tried beatings, confinement, threats of sale. She absorbed them all without sound. One visitor, a merchant from Bristol, remarked in a letter dated March 1702, "There is among Greyfield's domestics a mulatto girl, handsome of face yet unaccountably mute. The effect of her presence is singular. All stare, all wonder, and even the boldest seem disquieted." That disquiet grew. Charleston's 14. The Rice Council styled themselves gentlemen of science. Their libraries boasted treatises on agriculture, anatomy, and the improvement of breed. They purchased instruments from London: iron calipers, obstetric forceps, glass vessels for distillation, ostensibly for experiments in crop yield, though more often applied to the bodies of the enslaved. James Rutherford, magistrate, recorded in his plantation log a trial in seasoning, wherein young men were locked in a furnace chamber to test endurance. Marcus Sutton, notorious for brutality, prided himself on correcting the obstinacy of women heavy with child. Samuel Kingsley devised plans for selective pairings, convinced that new generations could be engineered like horses. These were not hidden crimes but boasts, exchanged over brandy at Greyfield's table, and always in the corner, pouring drink or clearing plates, was Esperanza, silent, watchful. 15 years, silence became her armor, her ledger, her slow accumulation of knowledge. She learned who favored claret, who kept mistress, who feared. She memorized the combinations of Greyfield's strongbox, the signals sent between plantations, the peculiar rivalries that set councilman against councilman. The enslaved around her understood. In whispered kitchens and cabins they passed her presence as a story. The quiet one here, the quiet one keeps. Some began to slip her fragments of news of ships bound for Spanish Florida, of revolts in the Caribbean, of medicines that could render a man weak or senseless, but she never spoke. A house of cruelty. It was in the Greyfield kitchens that she first saw the coal furnace stoked. There, iron branding irons glowed, pots of lye bubbled, knives were kept sharp. Once she witnessed the overseer Petton sear the flesh of a boy for theft of sugar. Another night guests gathered as Charles Warwick, drunk, forced a man to dance upon burning coals until he collapsed. Each act lodged within her like a mark in a hidden book. The spark, the record is terse, but every historian marks it as the turning point. Greyfield Ledger, 1715, boy Tom Whammy, age 12, sold to Rutherford for 32. Whammy had been Esperanza's charge since infancy, assigned to her side in the household. His laughter, rare, unbroken by Charleston's harshness, was perhaps the last tender sound she knew. His sale to Rutherford, whose name was synonymous with torment, cut deeper than lash or chain. From that moment, say later testimonies, the silence became not only shield, but weapon. Whispers in the city. By 1716, rumors stirred that the Rice Council planned a breeding program unprecedented in scope. Registers mention unusual purchases of women from Barbados and Senegal. Governor Johnson's correspondence, heavily redacted, alludes to domestic improvements to secure future generations of stock. For the enslaved, it meant the final stripping of humanity, kin reduced to arithmetic, wombs to inventory. For Esperanza, it meant the hour had come. The records close. The parish register of St. Philip's Church records only this: Esperanza, female servant in the household of Greyfield, continued in residence until June of. What followed that summer would be remembered in rumor, song and secret histories, but never again in official ledgers until the aftermath. The uneasy household. The Greyfield estate was not unlike the others along the Cooper River. Broad fields of rice, shimmering under a humid sky, cabins pressed against the tray line, and a main house with brick foundations and shuttered windows. Yet visitors often remarked on a difference in its atmosphere, some strange heaviness clinging to the halls. One letter, dated December 1714, written by a young Anglican curate, survives in fragment. At Mr. Greyfield's plantation the very air was thick, oppressed. His servants cast downward looks. His family moved with guarded step. Most curious of all is the girl they call Esperanza, mute these many years, who passes between chambers with eyes like coals. Her silence carries weight greater than any sermon. At night I could swear she listens at doors. Whether exaggeration or not, such impressions multiplied. Esperanza's silence was not the passivity of resignation. It unsettled, suggesting an intent held back, a gathering storm behind composed features. Tools of the council. The Rice Council's pretenses of science grew bolder. From 1710 onward, receipts show shipments of instruments from London, obstetric forceps, described as newly improved for extraction of child, brass calipers for skull measurement, bladed fleams for bloodletting, mortars and pestles for grinding powder, glass retorts and alembics for distillation. These were paraded before dinner guests as symbols of refinement, even as they were pressed into darker service. The council's journals, what few survive, make ghastly reading. One entry in Marcus Sutton's hand, 1712, notes, subject expired after incision of the cranium, observed the pulsation of the brain for near 17 seconds before cessation. Esperanza present in chamber, attending the lamp. How much she understood, none can say, but she stood within earshot of every plan, every theory, every cruelty justified as improvement. Domestic whispers. Other enslaved servants began to interpret her silence as purpose. Women in the washhouse recalled her tracing symbols in the ash with her finger, crosses, circles, letters, half-learned. In the kitchen she handled knives with a precision beyond mere cook's work. One testimony, given decades later by a woman named Adela, who had been a child on Greyfield's estate, claimed, the quiet one, she knew things. She could put her hand to the belly of a woman heavy with child and say, if it would be boy or girl. The masters thought it trick, but we knew. We said she carried old knowing, whether truth or embroidery. The perception of Esperanza, as something more than servant, spread like an undercurrent, whisper to whisper, a ledger of flesh. The council's cruelty extended beyond experiment into accountants. Surviving plantation ledgers read like inventories of tools. Negro girl, 13, uterine prolapse, unfit for field. Boy, 16, seizures after trepanation, of no value. Woman, 22, twins produced, retained. Esperanza turned these pages in Greyfield's study when clearing away goblets, when laying out instruments. She saw her people reduced to defects and profits, the human body catalogued as. In one margin she left the only mark ever traced by her hand, a line drawn in ink through the name of Tom Whaming, 12, sold. The growing dread. By 1715, A shift in the household became undeniable. Fires were kept burning long after meals had ended. Doors were bolted from within. Greyfield's wife wrote to her sister in Savannah, "There is something malign in the very timbers of this place. The servants cross themselves when Esperanza passes. My husband insists she is useful, yet I fear her presence darkens every chamber. It is as though her silence speaks louder than words." Even among the planters, small superstitions crept in. Rutherford refused to drink wine handed by her. Kingsley swore she had stood at his bedside one night though all doors were locked. Warwick jested that her eyes followed him like the paintings in a popish chapel. Still, none dared send her away. She had become part of the fabric of Greyfield's estate, a fixture at their councils, a mute shadow at their side. Artifacts of terror. Among the most disturbing artifacts linked to these years is a surviving inventory, housed in the Charleston archives marked restricted access. Iron collars, heated in furnace, bone saws, 4 speculum of brass bent from use, set of anatomical drawings, copied after Vesalius, stained with grease, 1 furnace chamber brick-lined capable of sustaining constant coal fire. That furnace, at the heart of Greyfield's kitchen, would become the site of vengeance remembered for generations. But in these early years it was spoken of as an experiment, a curiosity, its steady heat used for trials in endurance, and Esperanza stood nearby, the coal dust blackening her hands, the flames reflected in her dark, watchful eye, the silence as witness. It was said she remembered everything, every cry from the cabins, every cruel laugh across the dining table, every ledger entry that reduced a child to coin. While the planters boasted of their dominion, she compiled a ledger of her own, not of ink but of memory. In that hidden ledger the names of 14 men stood inscribed, each bound to her by deed and cruelty. By the end of 1715, the Greyfield estate was thick with unease. Guests left quickly, preferring the noise of Charleston taverns to the suffocating quiet of Greyfield's hall. Servants whispered of the mute one, as though she were both curse and guardian, and in the shadows of the kitchen furnace, Esperanza's patience hardened into intent. The council had sown seeds of horror in their pursuit of science and dominion. They had not yet realized those seeds had found their most dangerous soil in the silence of one woman, the council's ambition. By the spring of 1715, Charleston was no longer just a port town but a laboratory in the eyes of the planters. The Rice Council spoke with growing confidence, claiming their wealth gave them the privilege to improve the very stock of mankind. Their meetings, once whispered behind shuttered windows, became semi-public, couched in the language of agriculture and progress. The surviving address on breeding delivered by Edmund Greyfield to the Assembly of Planters is chilling. The Negro race, though serviceable, suffers from defects of constitution. By careful pairing, by observation of their offspring, and by judicious correction of flaws, we may secure not merely stronger laborers, but a better class of subject. Let our plantations not only yield rice and indigo, but also generations of improved men. The audience applauded. In their minds this was refinement, not barbarity. But in the cabins and fields, terror spread like fire. Experiments in flesh. Records show the council began pairing women against their will, forcing unions and recording outcomes like breeders at a horse fair. Births were catalogued with obsessive detail, the span of shoulders, the curvature of skull, the girth of thigh. Children not meeting standards were sold off before their 5th year, torn from mothers who clawed at wagon wheels until beaten back. One mutilated ledger from Marcus Sutton reads like an inventory of livestock. Twin males stillborn, noted pelvic narrowness of mother, girl age 3 bow-legged, value diminished, sold to Florida. Boy 7 high aptitude for letters, retained for further trial. To the council every body was a specimen. To Esperanza, every name was an ember, added to the growing fire smoldering inside her silence. The servants' fear thickened in the quarters. Women spoke of hiding newborns in the swamps, preferring death by fever or alligator to the council's scalpel. Men whispered of flight to Spanish Florida, though patrols made escape nearly impossible. Esperanza's presence became a talisman. Some believed her silence bound curses. Others claimed she could read men's thoughts by the look in their eyes. At night mothers pressed her hands to their children's foreheads, murmuring prayers in Kikongo and Yoruba, as if her touch alone could ward off the council's hunger. Adela, who later testified in her old age, recalled, "We called her La Sombra, the shadow. She did not smile, did not weep, But when she stood beside you, it was like a wall between you and them. I think even the masters feared her, though they would not admit it. Charleston's uneasy gentry, even outside the plantations, whispers spread. Taverns echoed with uneasy jokes about the doctors of rice. A merchant wrote to London, "These Carolina gentlemen pursue strange inquiries, part agricultural, part anatomic. Their kitchens stink of burning flesh, and their women speak of sleepless nights. There is unease here, as if the devil himself walks the marshes." Governor Johnson dismissed such concerns, insisting the council represented progress and prosperity. Yet he too is noted in surviving minutes as urging discretion, fearful that London might frown upon experiments too openly grotesque. Esperanza at the furnace. The coal furnace in Greyfield's kitchen became the center of her work. Night after night she shoveled coal, tending the steady roar of flame. It was used to sterilize instruments, to temper iron collars, to heat branding irons. The planters barely glanced at her. To them she was background, an appliance as invisible as the fire itself. But Esperanza studied every tool that passed through those flames, their weight, their edges, their weaknesses. She listened as the council laughed over their wine, boasting of their results, never knowing the mute girl had memorized each word. A fragment from Sutton's journal, 1715 notes, "The Lima girl remains obedient, useful with fire, stares often but causes no trouble. Her silence grows wearisome." They mistook her silence for obedience. In truth, it was the silence of a ledger balancing, of scales preparing to tip. The mask of obedience. By mid-1715, Esperanza had learned the art of invisibility. She carried trays, refilled goblets, cleared bones from the table, all while absorbing their secrets. She watched the physicians measure skulls with brass calipers, heard them speculate on hybrid vigor and negroid deficiency. She never turned away from the cruelty. She watched every incision, every experiment, as if burning them into her mind. Servants whispered that she did not sleep. Some swore she walked the halls at night, her shadow long in the moonlight, pausing outside the council chamber, as if she understood the language of their papers even without letters. Charleston, 1715, a city at the edge, beyond Greyfield's estate. Charleston simmered. News from Europe spoke of war and rebellion. Spanish raiders threatened from Florida. Native groups, armed and restless, stirred uprisings in the backcountry. Within this pressure, the council's arrogance grew. They saw themselves as men of destiny, pioneers shaping both land and flesh. Yet in the very kitchens of their estates, a woman they dismissed as mute servant was shaping a destiny of her own. The turning of silence. By autumn of 1715, something shifted in Esperanza. Servants noticed her gaze had hardened. She began to linger at the furnace, watching flames rise higher than needed. She kept scraps of coal hidden in her apron, leaving smudges across the floor. Adela later recalled, "It was in those months her silence changed. Before, it was the quiet of sorrow. After, it was the quiet of waiting." She looked at the masters like one might look at wood before striking flint. The Rice Council believed they held dominion over life and death, over womb and bone. They saw themselves as masters of science, fathers of a new order. What they did not see was the reckoning their cruelty was calling forth. In the steady roar of Greyfield's furnace, Esperanza tended not only coal but destiny itself. Her silence was no longer that of a victim. It was the silence before an inferno. The council declares its vision. In January of 1716, the Rice Council drafted a document now known only through fragments, preserved in the estate archives of Marcus Sutton. It was titled simply, "On the Hereditary Improvement of the Negro Race." It proposed the systematic pairing of women by physical attributes, to be observed across generations, with records to be maintained in bound ledgers, for the greater advancement of Carolina. It was written in the pompous cadence of agricultural treatises, as though human flesh were no more than a crop. One excerpt survives, blotched with soot and mildew. "The issue of these unions shall be measured, weighed and recorded. Those found vigorous will be retained. Those lacking shall be liquidated by sale or otherwise disposed of." This was no longer an experiment. It was policy. Murmurs in the quarters. The quarters became a place of whispers and guarded prayer. Mothers hid their daughters beneath floorboards during inspections, smearing mud on their skin to make them appear sickly. Men sharpened tools in secret, not for harvest, but for defense. But against the patrols, against the dogs, against the sheer machinery of the council, open rebellion seemed impossible, and so they endured, waiting for some breach in the walls of power. Esperanza's name began to be spoken not in fear but as a vessel of hope. The enslaved called her La Justicia, justice. They said she had fire in her eyes, even if her lips were closed. Some swore she carried coal in her palms without being burned. Adela's later deposition before a magistrate captured the feeling. When she passed among us, the air shifted. She said nothing, but we felt it, as if a storm was gathering, but only she could hear the thunder, the unveiling of instruments. The council's meetings took on a grotesque theatricality. Instruments were laid out on long tables, forceps, calipers, bone saws, and curved knives imported from London surgeons. Glass jars arrived, sealed with wax containing fetuses preserved in cloudy spirits. Servants were forced to polish these tools until they gleamed. They were placed in velvet-lined boxes, as if sacred relics, while the council toasted with brandy. Greyfield, ever the orator, declared at one gathering, "We are no longer mere planters, we are founders of a new Eden. Let posterity speak of Carolina as the birthplace of perfected man." The others roared with drunken approval, but in the kitchen Esperanza heard every word. Her hands moved steadily, tending the furnace, while her eyes fixed on the tools that would soon return to her flames. Charleston watchers, not all in Charleston, approved. Parish priests muttered against the council's unchristian dabblings. Merchants wrote uneasily to London, fearing reputational damage. A 1716 letter from a ship captain to his wife survives. These planters speak of breeding men as if they were cattle. Their halls echo with strange cries at night, and I have seen smoke at hours when no hearth should be lit. There is wickedness here, and I think the sea itself recoils from this shore. Yet the council's wealth shielded them. Rice exports surged. Indigo shipments fattened purses, and so long as coin flowed, London turned its gaze elsewhere. Esperanza's shadow deepens. Within the estates, Esperanza's silence became unbearable to the master. They mocked her muteness, tested her obedience with cruel jests, but she never flinched. Some struck her, she did not cry out. Some pressed knives to her palms, she did not bleed before them. Her quiet endurance unsettled even the cruelest. One overseer wrote in a private memorandum, "The Lima girl unnerves the men. She obeys, yet watches too closely. I would have her sold, but Greyfield insists she is useful with fire. He does not see what burns behind her eyes." They dismissed her as a curiosity, a mute oddity. Yet more and more servants sought her out, whispering in her presence as though she were a priestess. Signs and omens. The year 1716 was marked by strange occurrences. A fever swept the rice fields, felling both enslaved and free alike. Lightning struck Greyfield's barn, burning the roof to blackened beams. A blood-red moon was recorded in the parish register that April described as a sign of judgment. In the quarters these were taken as omens. Mothers said the earth itself was preparing for vengeance. Fathers told their children to remember Esperanza's name, for she would be the instrument of deliverance. The council grows bolder. Despite these whispers, the council pressed on. They expanded their ledgers, ordering new paper from London by the crate. They summoned physicians from Barbados and Jamaica, who arrived with trunks of additional instruments. One surviving bill of sale lists 12 steel scalpels imported from Bristol, 4 sets of obstetric forceps, 6 bone saws, 1 brass cranial measuring device, for the improvement of Negro skull. Each item was duly entered into the inventory. Each passed through Esperanza's hands, heated, polished, placed back into velvet cases. The council saw themselves as masters of heredity. They did not know that in their kitchens and corridors, a reckoning was already forming. The furnace waits. By mid-year, the coal furnace had become more than an instrument to Esperanza. It was her confessional, her altar. She lingered by its roar, watching the flames lick iron white hot, as if testing the patience of judgment itself. Adela remembered. I saw her once alone, her face lit red by the coals. She held a shard of iron in the fire until it glowed, then plunged it into water. The hiss was like a serpent. She looked at me, and for the first time she smiled. It was the only smile anyone ever recalled seeing on Esperanza's face. The silence before the fire. The council believed themselves untouchable. Charleston whispered but did not rise. London turned away. Their wealth bought silence. Their cruelty bought compliance. Yet silence has limit. Esperanza's silence was not theirs. Hers was the silence of waiting embers, of air thick with smoke before a blaze erupts. The year 1716 would not pass quietly. The council did not know it, but their names were already written in fire. The ledger of flesh. By the spring of 1716, the council's experiment had transformed into ritualized bureaucracy. Their ledgers, bound in calfskin and sealed with brass clasps, swelled with entries written in the careful hands of clerks. Each page bore columns labeled mother, issue, weight, limbs, defects, prognosis. What began as crude observation soon hardened into a grotesque catalogue. The enslaved were no longer recorded as persons but as specimens. One surviving page, recovered from the ruins of Greyfield's estate, reads, infant, female, mother of Guinea stock, father unrecorded, limbs uneven, skull narrow, prognosis, unfit, recommended for removal. The word removal is underlined twice. The tools at work. The imported physicians wasted no time demonstrating their methods. They measured skulls with brass calipers, recorded pulse rates with pendulum timers, and examined pelvic bones by forceful intrusion. Forceps were tested not only on deliveries but upon the already born, clamped around heads to observe resilience of cranial matter. Ether, new to the colonies, was employed in brutal experiments that left some insensate and others dead. These acts were cloaked in the rhetoric of science. Greyfield declared before the council, "It is the surgeon's knife that separates progress from savagery. Let no man call us cruel, for cruelty is the tool of the ignorant. We cut, we measure, we improve." But in the quarters, these words translated only as terror. Mothers hid their infants when the physicians approached. Fathers prayed that illness might disguise strength, lest their children be marked for improvement. Charleston's unease. Rumors spread beyond the estate. Dockworkers whispered of strange shipments, crates of surgical steel, barrels of spirits for preserving flesh. Merchants complained that the council's ledgers were heavier with anatomy than with rice. One parish sermon recorded in the diary of Reverend Samuel Pryor warned, these men would remake God's children by their own design. Such pride invites only wrath, for the clay is not greater than the potter. I fear the fire that will come. The pews fell silent at his word, yet none dared confront the council directly. Their wealth shielded them, their slaves silenced them, and the city, bound by dependence, endured. Esperanza, at the threshold, through it all, Esperanza remained stationed by the furnace. Every new shipment of instruments passed through her hands, unwrapping, cleaning, stoking fire enough to harden edges or mend warped blades. Witnesses noted her peculiar attention to each piece. She would hold calipers against her own skull as though testing their cruelty. She pressed the jaws of forceps against her arm, leaving pale indentations on her skin. Adela later testified, it was as if she spoke to them without words, as if she was telling them they would not outlast her. A birth observed. One event became a whispered turning point. In May, an enslaved woman went into labor. Instead of permitting the midwives of the quarters, the council insisted on attendance by their physicians. Esperanza was ordered to keep the furnace blazing for sterilizing instruments. The woman screamed as metal tools invaded her body, her cries echoing across the night. The infant was pulled forth with forceps, its skull bruised and bleeding. The physicians scribbled notes as though the mother's agony were nothing more than a lecture. Esperanza stood at the door, soot on her face, her eyes fixed upon the child. She said nothing, but witnesses swore her jaw clenched so hard it cracked the skin of her lip. The infant died before dawn. The mother lingered a week before succumbing to infection. Both were entered in the ledger. Neither was marked with a name. The Archive of Atrocities. By mid-year, the council had assembled a grisly archive, shelves filled with jars of preserved tissue, drawings of dissected infants, circulated among them like trophy. An inventory from July written in Sutton's hand. Lists. Jar of fetus. 3 months. Guinea mother. Twin heads. Stillborn, hydrocephalus, skull fragments labeled Negro versus Mulatto, each item numbered, stored, indexed. This was not secrecy but pride. They believed themselves authors of a new discipline, what Greyfield named hereditary science of Carolina. Whispers of revolt, for the enslaved. Patience wore thin. Men gathered in corners of the quarters,
their whispers carried by the hum of incense. Women spoke of spirits, who would bring fire from the earth itself. Children sang in hushed voices, cold that burns, cold that hides, cold that opens master's eyes. Though no one dared speak aloud, all gazes turned toward Esperanza. She remained silent, but silence itself became language. Her very presence was a vow, the overseer's warning. In July, an overseer named Holt delivered a private memorandum to Greyfield. It survives today, folded and stained. "Sir, I must speak plain. The Negroes are restless. The Lima girl watches too close. I have seen men bow their heads as she passes, and women lay food at her door. She does not speak, yet she commands. I beg you, sell her before misfortune falls." Greyfield dismissed the warning with laughter. To him, Esperanza was nothing but a mute kitchen hand. Her furnace kept his instruments sharp, and that was all. He did not see that Holt's words were prophecy. The furnace transformed. By August, Esperanza's relationship with the furnace grew almost ritualistic. She stayed long after her tasks were done, staring into the blaze as though receiving communion. She began to collect fragments, scraps of iron, shards of bone, tools discarded by physicians, and fed them to the flames one by one. Adela recounted, she would hold them until they burned her skin, but she did not flinch. The fire took everything, and when she rose, her eyes glowed as though the furnace lived inside her. It was no longer merely a tool of labor. It had become her sanctuary, her weapon in weight. A city braces. Charleston grew uneasy. As autumn approached, ships carried tales of the strange experiments of Carolina back to London. Priests murmured of sacrilege. Some planters not tied to the council began to avoid their gatherings, fearing contamination of reputation. Yet the council only doubled down. Their arrogance knew no ceiling. They toasted their new humanity with imported wine, their laughter carrying through the swampy night. They did not hear the sound beneath the hiss of coals, the whisper of Esperanza's silence growing louder than their drunken boast.
Prelude to Judgment. The year 1716 was waning, and with it the patience of the enslaved. The furnace roared nightly, a hungry mouth waiting to be filled. Esperanza's shadow stretched longer across the quarter, and though no one could yet say when, all knew what would come. The fire would not be contained forever. The doctrine of blood. By late summer of 1716, the council's obsession with heredity took on the tones of scripture. Their gatherings were no longer framed as meetings of planters, but as councils of prophets. Greyfield, increasingly gaunt from his mania, spoke in phrases half medical, half biblical. The seed of Africa, when tempered by Anglo stock, will yield the perfected serve. Flesh is clay, and we are the potters. The Almighty himself approves our labor, for have we not been given dominion? The others, Sutton, Harriman, Ward, and the rest, echoed his creed. They argued ratios of Negro to English blood with the seriousness of theologians. They debated which jawlines and which hip bones proved most promising. They called it science, but in truth it was faith of the most monstrous kind. The anatomist's theater. To give their dogma weight, they staged demonstration. In a chamber beneath Greyfield's estate, wooden benches were arranged like a small theater. The enslaved were forced to sit silent while physicians presented bodies, sometimes living, sometimes dead, upon a central table. Witnesses later testified that infants were displayed as specimens, their bodies handled as though already lifeless. Young men were forced to stand naked while their limbs were measured and compared. One account preserved in the marginal notes of a physician named Cawthorne describes female, age 20, pelvis broad, deemed promising for parturition. Demonstration given upon the living subject. Midwives dismissed. Uterine exploration attempted under restraint. Patients screamed throughout. The crowd of planters applauded, as though attending an opera. Charleston's revulsion. Word spread quickly. Theaters of dissection might be accepted in London or Paris, but in Charleston, where every man's fortune rested upon enslaved labor, the public staging of such cruelties unsettled even hardened planters. Merchants withdrew from council banquet. Preachers thundered against the false priesthood of surgeons. One anonymous pamphlet, circulated in the docks, warned, "They who weigh men like cattle and split mothers as hogs, shall find themselves meat for the fire." The council dismissed these murmurs. Yet unease seeped into the city like damp through a foundation. Everyone knew the violence of slavery. Few wished to look upon its innards so plainly. Esperanza's stillness. Through this crescendo, Esperanza's stillness. Through this crescendo, Esperanza remained silent at the furnace. She prepared the branding irons, tempered the calipers, burned clean the bloody knives. But each night after the last man had staggered to bed, she lingered. She pressed her palms to the furnace doors until blisters rose, then hardened into scars. She gathered ashes into small clay pots, and scattered them around the quarters, whispering not words but breath. Adela later said, "It was like she was planting seeds, but her seeds were ash. We believed those ashes would grow into fire that no man could quench." A child's death. One night in September, a child of 7, his name remembered as Kofi, was summoned to the theater. The physicians wished to test mental reflex. They forced him to repeat words in English, struck him when he faltered, then forced open his skull with a trepanning drip. The boy screamed until silence overtook him. His body was placed in a jar of spirits, his name erased from the ledger. The quarters howled in grief, yet no rebellion rose. Fear was a collar too tight, but something shifted. When Esperanza walked among them that night, no one looked away. Eyes followed her as though she carried their grief like a torch. Greyfield's madness. Greyfield himself descended deeper into mania. He ceased speaking to his own kin, ate sparingly, and spent nights scratching diagrams upon his study wall. Circles of bloodlines, arrows pointing toward a figure labeled Specimen 0. One servant reported that Greyfield muttered to himself, "She will bear it, the silent one, the Peruvian. Her womb will prove the crucible." Whether he meant Esperanza, none can say with certainty, but his fixation grew sharper, his gaze more often falling upon her when she stoked the furnace. A city divided by autumn, Charleston was fractured, some aligned with the council, eager for promises of stronger stock. Others recoiled, fearing divine judgment and economic ruin. Letters to London warned of unchristian spectacles. Ships carried rumors that South Carolina was less a colony than a laboratory. The governor himself, Johnson, began to distance his office, yet he did not act. To strike against the council meant striking against the wealth that sustained the colony. Thus, silence prevailed. Cowardice disguised as patience. Esperanza's fire ritual. As the council grew bolder, so too did Esperanza's nightly rite. She began placing tokens into the coals, teeth from butchered hogs, feathers of blackbirds, scraps of the ledgers she quietly stole. Adela swore she once saw Esperanza hold a page marked with Kofi's measurements, feed it into the flames, and watch it curl into ash, with tears streaming silently down her cheeks. The quarters took these acts as signs. Children whispered, "The furnace eats their word." Women pressed food to Esperanza's door. Men sharpened hidden blades, though they did not yet know when they would be called to use them. The physicians depart. In October, 2 of the imported physicians abruptly departed for England. Their letters, later discovered, reveal unease. What began as curiosity has soured into madness. Greyfield grows unhinged, and the air of Charleston thickens with hatred. "I fear we shall all burn with him should we remain." But others stayed, those too enthralled by cruelty, or too indebted to council gold. The furnace, as judgment. By November, Esperanza's furnace was no longer seen as merely functional. The enslaved began to call it La Boca. They whispered that one day it would open and swallow their masters whole. Esperanza never confirmed, never denied, but her silence spoke louder than sermons. Gathering storm. The nights grew colder. The council planned a grand assembly for December to unveil their findings. Pamphlets promised proof of their hereditary science, invitations sent to London and beyond. But beneath their pride, dread festered. Servants whispered of Esperanza's shadow flickering against the furnace walls, taller than any human form. The stage was nearly set. Charleston braced itself, not knowing whether judgment would fall from heaven or rise from coal. The gathering announced, by late November of 1716, handbills spread across Charleston, announcing a symposium upon the improvement of the Negro race by scientific art. They bore Greyfield's seal and promised demonstrations, unprecedented in the annals of natural philosophy. Invitations were dispatched to neighboring colonies and even to the Royal Society in London. Though few scholars dared risk the voyage, still the council believed themselves on the verge of immortality. This event, they declared, would cement their names alongside Harvey and Newton. Rumor, however, ran faster than their handbills. Dockside merchants muttered that the council planned a public vivisection. Women spat when Greyfield's servants passed by. Preachers thundered from pulpits that Sodom's fate awaited Charleston. The stage prepared. The theater beneath Greyfield's estate was enlarged for the occasion. Benches were reinforced. Lanterns hung from iron hooks. A great ledger of findings was copied thrice, each page written in the stiff hand of Harriman. Tables of skull sizes, ratios of calf to thigh, annotations of yield in childbirth. Beside the central table stood the furnace, Esperanza's charge. She polished its black doors until they reflected the lamplight like twin mirrors. To the council, it was merely the forge where branding irons were sterilized. To the enslaved, it had become prophecy. Esperanza never spoke of the coming gathering, but each night she lingered longer by the coals, her scarred hands stroking the iron as if soothing a restless beast. Charleston's dread. In the taverns, whispers grew darker. Sailors swore they had seen barrels marked, anatomical materials unloaded by lantern light. A pamphlet nailed to the church door read, "Attend not the council's theater. Their science is a covenant with hell, and those who behold it will be damned with them." Yet curiosity gnawed at Charleston. Though repelled, many longed to glimpse what had so horrified rumor. Attendance, some said, would be a civic duty to witness and condemn the ledgers of flesh. On the eve of the symposium, the council assembled to review their pages rustled in candlelight. Greyfield insisted upon displaying not only charts but specimens. The jar containing little Kofi's skull, skeletons wired upright, women forced to stand while their pelvises were measured before the assembly. Sutton objected mildly. Might such display provoke disorder? Greyfield struck the table with his fist. Truth provokes only cowards. We are the vanguard of creation itself. Let them sneer. Posterity shall vindicate us. Esperanza observed. During this rehearsal, Esperanza entered to tend the furnace. The men scarcely noticed her, yet a servant swore he saw Greyfield pause, watching her with an intensity that unsettled even his hardened companion. Some later claimed that in that moment, Greyfield whispered, "The womb of silence shall be our proving ground." No record confirms it, but the rumor clung. The night before, the enslaved quarters thrummed with unease. Mothers clutched their children. Men sharpened tools not for work but for war. Adela recalled Esperanza moving among them with deliberate calm. She carried a small sack filled with ash, scattering handfuls at the thresholds. She pressed her blistered palms against foreheads, leaving smudges like bran. "We thought she prayed," Adela said decades later, but it was not prayer, it was promise. The day of assembly, December 3rd, dawned gray and cold. Carriages rattled along the streets toward Greyfield's estate. Planters, merchants, curious townsfolk, all drawn by dread and spectacle. Inside the theater, lanterns smoked. The council took their seats upon a raised dais, their ledgers arrayed like sacred texts. Greyfield presided, pale and trembling, eyes shining with feverish triumph. Esperanza fed coal into the furnace, the roar of flame muffling her breath. To those in the benches, she was invisible, another shadow at the edge of the stage. The opening oration, Greyfield began with solemnity. "Gentlemen, we stand upon the cusp of revelation. Nature has hidden her laws in flesh, and we, her appointed surgeons, shall unveil them. Here you will see the arithmetic of blood, the geometry of bone, the destiny of mankind inscribed upon the body of the Negro." Murmurs swept the crowd, some enthralled, others horrified. A preacher rose to denounce him, but was silenced by guards at the door. The first demonstrations, a young woman was brought forth, forced to disrobe as Greyfield pointed to her pelvis with calipers. He spoke of proportions suited to fecundity. The woman wept silently, eyes fixed upon Esperanza by the furnace. Next came the jarred remains of children, paraded as evidence of failed unions. The crowd gasped. Some turned away, others leaned forward hungrily. The final specimen, covered by a cloth, awaited its unveiling. Greyfield's hand trembled as he grasped the veil. The whisper before the fire. In that charged moment, several witnesses swore they heard Esperanza speak for the first time. A whisper, carried by the crackle of flame. "The furnace waits." The words were not shouted, nor repeated, yet every ear seemed to catch them. Greyfield faltered, cloth still in his grasp.
A shiver ran through the hall. The unveiling, beneath the veil lay a pregnant woman, bound to the table, her belly swollen, her face contorted with terror. Greyfield raised his hands as if consecrating her body. Behold the crucible of our experiment. Here lies the future of perfected stock. We shall. His words were drowned by a sudden roar as Esperanza stoked the furnace to a blaze. So fierce the iron glowed red, the hall shuddered. Sweat broke upon brow. The bound woman screamed, and the crowd surged in panic. The gathering collapses. Chaos erupted. Some fled for the doors, others shouted for Greyfield's arrest. The council scrambled to defend their work, waving ledgers like shield. Esperanza stood motionless, her hands upon the furnace doors, eyes fixed upon the dais. The moment of judgment had come. The riot ignites. The hall resounded with confusion, shouts of blasphemy, clashing with others crying, "Science!" Women fainted. Men shoved for the exit. The guards could not hold back the tide. In the midst of this storm, the bound woman's scream rose like a knife through cloth. Her belly heaved. Her wrists bled where the cords cut. Greyfield struck the lectern with both hands, his voice cracking. "Silence! You will witness destiny itself." But no silence came. Esperanza moves, while the council scrambled. Esperanza unlatched the iron doors of the furnace. Heat poured forth in a blinding wave. Flames licked outward, illuminating her face. Calm as stone, she did not shout, nor gesture. She merely opened the way. The crowd recoiled, covering their faces. Greyfield stared, transfixed by her stillness, as though realizing too late that the instrument he had scorned had chosen its master. The first to fall, Sutton, seeking to seize control, ordered the guards to restrain Esperanza. But as two approached, the furnace exhaled. A sheet of fire burst outward, searing them where they stood. One collapsed screaming, his flesh melting. The other staggered blindly into the benches, spreading panic. The crowd shrieked. People trampled one another in their rush for the door. Benches splintered beneath the crush. The council, trapped upon their dais, found themselves suddenly the hunted. Greyfield's defiance. Greyfield did not flee. He raised his arms, eyes blazing, and shouted, "This is no accident. This is no accident. This is purification. Behold the womb of fire." But no one heeded him. Even his own councilmen shrank away, their ledgers dropping into the dust. Esperanza's gaze never wavered from the dais. She stepped forward, her hands blistered, and with a strength none had guessed, she seized the heavy iron poker. The woman on the table, amidst the chaos, the pregnant woman still writhed upon the slab. Some in the audience tried to reach her, but were beaten back by the heat. Then, before all eyes, Esperanza approached her. She pressed her palm to the woman's forehead, leaving a black brand of and softly, so softly, that only those nearest heard, she said, "Your pain ends in flame, not in their books." And with a single strike of the poker, she shattered the manacles that bound the woman's wrist. The freed captive stumbled back, shielding herself from the fire, while Esperanza turned again to the dais. The council cornered. Greyfield and his companions huddled, clutching one another, their books of measurements scattered like fallen scripture. Esperanza ascended the steps one by one, the poker glowing in her grasp. Behind her the furnace roared, each breath louder, as though feeding upon her will. Greyfield whispered to Harriman, "She is the womb, she is the proof." But Harriman broke and fled, leaping from the stage into the shrieking crowd, never seen again in Charleston.
The doors sealed. Those who tried to escape found the theater's doors barred from outside. No servant confessed to this act, yet all agreed the bolts fell into place as though moved by unseen hands. The crowd howled like trapped animals, fists beat against the doors, windows shattered, but smoke already filled the chamber, choking lungs. Some claimed to see figures in the smoke, children's faces, pale and watchful. Others swore the flames shaped themselves into crucibles, calipers, chain. Greyfield's play. At last Greyfield sank to his knees before Esperanza. Sweat poured down his face, his wig askew, his papers clutched like a priest's rosary. "Spare us, Esperanza," he begged. "You, above all, understand the fire. You kept it, you tended it. You are our sister in science. Together we can forge a new Eden." His words broke as Esperanza lowered the poker to the floor with a clang. She leaned close, her cracked lips parting. "No Eden, only ash. The consuming." She flung open the furnace wide. With a roar like a beast unchained, the fire leapt forth, engulfing the days. Greyfield's scream mingled with Sutton's, with Harriman's fleeing footsteps cut short in flame. The council burned together, their bodies thrashing in silhouette before crumbling to blackened heaps. The smell of scorched flesh rolled over the panicked assembly. The pregnant woman, still trembling, covered her ears and wailed. Some spectators fainted where they stood, others clawed desperately at the walls. Esperanza alone remained unmoved, her eyes reflecting the inferno she had unleashed. The ash silence. When the cries at last subsided, when the furnace devoured its fill, a silence fell over the charred hall. The great theater that had been raised to glorify science was now a tomb of smoke. Ash drifted like snow. Pages of the council's ledgers, half burnt, fluttered down upon corpses. Figures once lauded as gentlemen of progress were reduced to indistinguishable heaps. Esperanza walked slowly among the remains, her footsteps crunching upon bone. At the center, she lifted Greyfield's charred ledger, its edges glowing faintly. She pressed it into the coals, until nothing remained but dust. Witnesses in shock. Those who survived the night would never speak freely of what they saw. Some left Charleston entirely, swearing never to return. Others drank themselves to ruin. A few, however, whispered in corners that the fire had been guided, that it had recognized guilt and spared the innocent. One preacher declared from his pulpit, "The Lord sent not angel nor plague, but a woman with fire in her hand." Esperanza's departure. When at last the doors were unbarred, Esperanza was gone. Some said she vanished into the smoke, others claimed she walked calmly into the street, barefoot, leaving blackened prints upon the cobblestones until they faded into nothing. No body was ever found. What remained was the furnace, warped and twisted, its iron doors fused shut. The morning after, when dawn broke over Charleston, smoke still curled from the theater's windows. The building stood blackened, its ornate columns cracked, its banners in tatters. Those who approached found the doors ajar at last. Inside, silence broken only by the hiss of dying embers. The air reeked of burnt flesh and iron. Ash coated every surface, benches, railings, the remains of men and women who had fled too slowly. The dais was a ruin of melted brass and bone. Where Greyfield's council once stood, only twisted heaps of char remained. And of Esperanza de Lima, there was no trace. Suppression begins. By mid-morning the surviving aldermen convened in haste at the parish hall. Their faces were pale, their wigs askew, their eyes hollow with smoke. It was agreed at once the event could not be recorded truthfully. Too many merchants, too many creditors, too much reputation was at stake. The official decree, signed and sealed, read, "On the night of June 17th, 1716, a lamp overturned within the theater, sparking an accidental fire which claimed the lives of 14 distinguished gentlemen and several attendants. No mention was made of the furnace, nor of Esperanza." Witnesses silenced. Those who spoke otherwise were swiftly dealt with. One midwife who claimed she had seen Esperanza walk barefoot into the street was taken to the stocks and publicly whipped for hysteria. A sailor swore he saw a woman's figure vanish into the smoke. He was pressed into naval service and shipped out within a week. As for the freed pregnant captive, she was never recorded in parish registers again. Some said she was hidden among maroons in the swamps. Others whispered she perished in childbirth. Her absence became another silence folded into the record. The furnace interred. At great expense, the remains of the coal furnace were pried from the theater. Its warped doors, fused by the heat, were dragged in chains to the Cooper River and heaved into the water. Yet some dockhands swore it did not sink. They claimed the iron hissed and steamed, then floated for a time, glowing faintly in the dark current, before slipping beneath with a sound like a drawn breath. Fishermen avoided that stretch of river for generations. Nets lowered there came back scorched, or else tangled with charred bone. Greyfield's ledger. Among the ash a single artifact was recovered, a half-burnt ledger belonging to Dr. Greyfield. Its cover bore the stamp, "Property of the Charleston Anatomical Society." Its first pages recorded the usual weights, caliper measurements, infant stillbirth, but midway the ink dissolved into smudges, as if scalded by boiling water. Only a fragment remained legible, scrawled in Greyfield's hand. "The womb is not the vessel, but the fire itself, and she is its keeper." The ledger was locked away in the society's cabinet, marked "Do not circulate." By the century's end, it had vanished entirely. Rumors in the colonies. Despite suppression, rumors spread. Sailors carried them up and down the coast. Merchants repeated them in taverns. Preachers thundered against them from pulpits. Some called Esperanza a witch, servant of the devil sent to chastise Charleston's pride. Others called her a saint, a deliverer who avenged the suffering of women and the enslaved. In New Orleans, tales grew of La Mujer del Fuego, who walked unburned from the furnace of her enemy. In the Carolinas, whispers persisted that her blackened footprints could still be seen in the cobblestones when the moon hung low. Charleston's haunted reputation. For decades afterward, Charleston's theater district bore the mark of that night. The new playhouses built in its stead were said to echo strangely, as if the cries of burning men lingered in their rafters. Performers refused to rehearse near midnight, claiming to hear a woman's low voice singing in Spanish beneath the board. Merchants who sat on the front benches often reported the sudden stench of smoke in the middle of a performance, though no lamp was lit nearby. A generation passed, and still parents warned their children, "Do not stray near the river at night, lest the furnace woman take you." The surviving families. The lineages of the 14 burned men dwindled in curious ways. Several sons died young of fever, others left no heirs at all. By the 1760s it was remarked in parish ledgers that none of Greyfield's direct blood remained in Charleston. A marginal note in faded ink beside one baptismal record read, "The Lord extinguished their seed. Who wrote it is unknown." Secret papers. In 1799, a clergyman cataloguing old diocesan archives uncovered a folio of sealed letters, labeled regarding the theater fire. They bore witness accounts too detailed to be mere invention. One described Esperanza's eyes glowing as she opened the furnace. Another swore her skin did not blister even as flames licked her arms. The folio was hastily stamped redacted and transferred to London. No trace remains in Charleston today. Esperanza's fate. As for Esperanza herself, her end was never recorded. Some believed she drowned with the furnace, her body claimed by the Cooper River. Others claimed she fled north, joining maroon communities hidden deep in the swamps, living out her years as an unseen matriarch. And there were those who believed she never died at all, that she became one with the fire, a spirit stalking Charleston's forges and hearth. In 1836, when a smith shop burned mysteriously in the city, one apprentice swore he saw her silhouette in the smoke, hair streaming, eyes alight. The story bends. By the 19th century, Charleston's official histories mentioned the fire, only in passing, as a theatrical accident. Yet every generation someone whispered her name again, Esperanza de Lima, a woman without monument, without grave, yet whose memory lingered longer than the gentleman who tried to erase her. Her story passed not in ledgers, but in kitchens, in slave quarters, in the murmurs of women during childbirth, spoken as prayer or curse, depending on the lips that uttered it. The last Greyfield. By 1824 the Greyfield estate was no more. Its rice fields lay fallow, its great house sagging into ruin, shutters torn away by storms. The last heir, a frail boy named Thomas Greyfield III, died of fever before his 12th birthday. With him ended a name once spoken with dread. Neighbors claimed the estate was cursed, that no harvest ever grew well after the fire. Overseers hired to tend the land abandoned their posts, swearing they heard a woman's voice whispering in the fields at night. The manor was left to rot, its rafters collapsing, its cellars flooding until they resembled a blackened tomb. Silence in records. Charleston's parish ledgers, usually meticulous, became strangely thin around the years following the fire. Baptisms left unrecorded, burials listed without names. A clerk in 1839 scrawled in the margin, "The records were lost in flame as if Providence itself withheld them." Yet no such fire was known to have swept the archive. It was as though memory itself recoiled, erasing not only the Greyfields, but the very ink that once bound them to the city. The fire's legacy. Among enslaved families, Esperanza's tale was not forgotten. She was remembered not as a woman of flesh, but as a force. La Mujer del Fuego. Mothers whispered of her while tending the hearth, a woman who burned her masters alive, who took vengeance not with sword or musket, but with flame and silence. In hushed tones they prayed, "May her fire guard the womb, may her heat consume the chain." What the council meant as terror became, in secret, a story of deliverance. The furnace returns. In 1852,
Dock workers dredging the Cooper River claimed to snag a mass of iron in their nets. Hauling it up, they found a rusted shape with 2 fused doors, what looked like the maw of a furnace. Terrified, they pushed it back into the river, swearing never to speak of it. But word spread quickly. The furnace had risen again. Weeks later, a warehouse fire gutted a third of East Bay Street. No lamp, no accident was ever found. Witnesses swore they saw a woman's silhouette framed in the flames, her eyes like coals. The furnace was never recovered. Some say it still lies beneath the river's surface, waiting. The archivist's folio, now in the present century. Fragments remain. A singed letter in the British Library, unsigned, reading only, she burned them not with hatred, but with justice. Their screams are the gospel they deserve. A midwife's testimony, preserved in Spanish, hidden in Havana's archives. Her belly did not swell, yet she bore fire into the world. And here in Charleston's Historical Society, a final note, unsigned and undated, catalogued as miscellaneous, box. It reads, the men of Rice thought to master seed and womb, but the womb answered with flame, and her name was Esperanza de Lima. What cannot be buried? The city rebuilt itself, century after century. Hurricanes battered it, wars scarred it, commerce rose and fell, but in every age, whispers returned. A midwife alone at night hears footsteps in her stairwell. A smith working iron feels his forge blaze hotter, though no bellows pump the flame. A child swears a woman's face appeared in the smoke above a chimney. The records call it hysteria, legends call it haunting, and yet even now scholars turn pages, sift archives, and find blank spaces where her story should be. History recoils from her, and in that recoil lies her power. Closing words of the archivist. I set down this account not as proof, but as testament. Proof belongs to courts and ledgers. Testimony belongs to memory. The official histories will tell you, there was a fire, accidental, regrettable, nothing more. But the truth moves differently. It survives in margins, in fragments, in ash. It lives in the spaces silence cannot smother. Esperanza de Lima was a woman brought as an experiment. They thought her silence meant submission. They thought her womb could be measured, mastered, bred like cattle. They were wrong. Her silence was not emptiness, but waiting. Her womb was not their vessel, but their furnace. On that night in June of 1716 she opened the fire, and gave them back their own cruelty, their own ambition, their own screams. And though her body vanished into smoke, the city still walks in her shadow. This concludes the account of Esperanza de Lima. If you have listened this far, remember, some stories refuse burial, some flames do not die, and some names, no matter how officials try to erase them, remain. Esperanza de Lima is one of them.